All right, we are about 2 minutes after the hour right now. Let's get started. Welcome. This webinar is provided by Grant Makers for Education. Grant Makers for Education was founded 20 years ago, actually, excuse me, 25 years ago now, in 1995 on the premise that collective insights, shared resources, and constructive collaboration enable grant makers to make more intentional and impactful investments. GFE set out to demonstrate the power of these networks in effecting greater change, and still to this day exist to improve the outcomes of all learners by serving as a trusted partner for all education philanthropists as they adapt to the changes impacting our world. And as many of you may be keenly aware, we are in the midst of an enormous change to the way that we do work and also the way that our education system is being conducted and is currently structured. Today's specific webinar session comes to you from the Postsecondary Access and Attainment Group. We are an impact group underneath GFE. This means we're a collective of funders that specify in a targeted topic. So we focus on post-secondary education. This can be inclusive of college access, as well as students who are currently in college, individuals who are pursuing either a 2-year short-term degree or credential, or also 4-year bachelor's degree. Our end game is to make sure that we are providing our networks and communities with opportunities to learn and engage, such as this webinar today, as well as opportunities for shared collaboration, communication, and other networks that we can do to strengthen our overall grant making in post-secondary ed. On that note, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, where we will be discussing the current impact of COVID-19 on higher education through a state and federal lens, specifically with attention to the CARES Act. I am pleased to turn it over to our facilitator and moderator for today, Alex Harris, who is the current VP of Programs at the Harold L.K. Castle Foundation. Alex, would you like to take it away?
Thanks, Angela, and hello, everybody. Thank you so much for taking time from your busy schedules to join us today. This is a dramatic moment in time. In just 2 months, my home state of Hawaii went from the lowest unemployment in the country to the highest. 1 in 3 adults are now out of a job. And in the first week of our university system releasing an emergency fund, we received more than 2,000 requests from students for emergency aid and support. So this is the environment that we're in right now, where we have to support folks to and through college because we know that the jobs that are going to survive are mostly ones that require a post-secondary degree or credential. Now, philanthropy is nimble, but our response pales in comparison to government. And so our goal today is to share what's known about the $14 billion in the Federal CARES Act that impact higher education directly, and explore how philanthropy can help to fill the gaps. We have 3 terrific panelists. I'm going to ask each of them for a 3 to 4 minute opening statement. And as Angela said, I have a few prepared questions before opening to the audience at the end. So let's begin with Megan Koval, Vice President of Policy and Federal Relations from the National Alliance of Student Financial Aid Administrators. Megan, I'm wondering if you could just kick us off by walking through how the CARES Act impacts higher education and some of the implications for students and institutions. And perhaps you can also share some of the specific challenges that you're seeing right now.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. Thank you, Alex. And first, thank you all for including NASFA to be a part of this presentation. I did think I would just start at a very high level, letting you all know a little bit about NASFA. In case you do not, we are the trade association in DC that represents financial aid administrators on campuses across the university, across the country. And we also have about 3,000 member institutions and collectively represent 20,000 financial aid administrators. So we really kind of have a good idea of what's going on the ground right now. And our mission is twofold. It's number one, to help train financial aid administrators, but also on the public policy front to help advocate for policies that increase access and success to higher education. Normally we work on things like reauthorization and funding of the programs, but really since early March, almost all of our attention has been on COVID-19 and the impact that it's had on higher education. And we really initially started this when we were getting feedback from schools that they were bringing students home from study abroad programs. And we thought, oh, this is something maybe we'll have to get engaged in. And little did we know just how terrible this whole situation was going to be and how much it was going to impact higher education. So in the interest of time, I'll just say broadly that our work on COVID-19 has really focused on two areas. One, trying to get some waivers and flexibilities for institutions and students as it relates to things like return of Title IV funds, satisfactory academic progress, the way that the Pell Grant counts toward overall semester usage, federal work study. And then the second piece is really focusing on the distribution of the funds that were made available to institutions through the CARES Act, specifically through the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund. So those are kind of the two buckets of work that we've been doing. And really, most of the work has been on the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund. Which was big picture, $14 billion for institutions of higher education, and then $12 billion to schools, half of which has to be spent directly on students. Some quick fast facts here that makes this kind of an interesting fund for institutions to distribute is they are not Title IV dollars, but Title IV eligibility is required. And that's something that we are truthfully still unpacking for our schools and helping them figure out. The guidance says you have to be Title IV eligible or could be, and that could be piece is what is very difficult for schools to kind of work through right now. The other big piece that's important with these funds and that makes them different than a lot of other student aid issues that we work on is the focus here is not about need, it's about expense. So the school can only give the funds to students who have a demonstrated expense related to campus disruption because of COVID-19. So we've had a lot of questions coming in about, okay, but I have a student who has need. And this time we have to kind of really redirect and say, well, you have to be able to show there was an expense incurred. So that's something that's a little bit different. And then this money has to go, half of it, directly into the hands of students. And that's been a really important piece too. So if a student has a tuition balance, you cannot just say, you know what, I'm going to use that money and pay it off for you. It needs to go right to the hands of students. I'll wrap up very briefly. Again, it's hard to summarize all of this in 4 minutes by just saying the biggest challenges I think that institutions are facing and the financial aid offices, because we work with them so closely right now, are just that there have been multiple iterations of guidance on the distribution of these funds that have come down from the Department of Education, and each time there have been significant changes, which have been really kind of difficult for institutions to work through. So they're first getting a message of get this money, get it out the door to your students. At the same time, and still as of today, we don't have a full picture of who is eligible for these funds and who is not. So that is something that we are working through with students. And I'd say that is the biggest challenge. And related to that is just that there are a lot of restrictions tied to these funds. So I think there's a lot more that schools want to do with them that they can't actually do. So I'll go ahead and pause there and look forward to chatting more later in the Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you, Megan. So I think just a couple of quick takeaways. Of the 14 billion, approximately half or $6 billion goes directly to students out of the CARES Act. Institutions are still trying to figure out the correct way of apportioning those funds based upon evolving guidance from the federal government. So there's both a timing issue here and making sure that funds get to institutions and students, and also sort of a proper use of funds. Angela, I'm wondering if you have a quick moment. There may be folks on the line who are interested in knowing just the amounts that different institutions are apportioned based on formula. So if that's a piece of information that we have available, perhaps we could just leave that in the chat function for others. Let's turn now to Martha Snyder of HCM Strategists. HCM Strategists provides policy strategy across states and the country. And Martha, I'm really hoping that you could just give us sort of pick up where Megan left off and give us a sense of how states are responding to this crisis right now. And specifically, what are you seeing in higher education budgets as they're being prepared?
Sure. So first, I think just similar to the way Megan started off, a little bit about HCM Strategists. Pre-COVID, we worked in states on a variety of issues related to post-secondary access and equity policies, ranging from finance and funding policies to pathways policies in states that support student access and completion of high quality credentials. All of that has shifted to a COVID-19 lens and kind of an application of that view, equity, access, and completion, but with obviously the COVID-19 lens and the impacts of COVID-19 really dominating the conversation, how we approach our work in states. So we work with states kind of in three buckets. One, and as it relates to COVID-19, is certainly tracking the impact of COVID-19 on post-secondary education, most notably on equity for students of color and low-income students. And certainly the disparate impact, as we all know, kind of the most common discussed is the fact that sending students home, you have an inequitable impact on access to technology and broadband. But there's actually other impacts with the inequities of the economic crisis and the health crisis that could just completely disconnect or exacerbate the opportunities for those populations to even stay engaged. So kind of tracking the long-term impacts of that. Related, and certainly to your point, Alex, or your request, is understanding the implications on state revenues and the subsequent impact on state budgets, and what this means for both short-term and long-term investments in post-secondary education. Certainly not news to anyone that the financial impacts on state budgets is going to be profound. It's going to be felt for at least the next fiscal year, if not further fiscal years. We've already seen about 20 states adjust their 2020 revenue forecasts, none of them positive in any way. In California most recently, and certainly Michelle can speak to this, forecasting $54.3 billion deficit. New York's forecast in March, very early on in this crisis, was at $13.3 billion, only expected to go up. Florida, similarly, about an $8 to $10 billion impact. Obviously, this is impacting state budgets, and while technically 30 states have passed fiscal year 21 budgets, all states are anticipating having to make adjustments to those. And we absolutely see an impact of this on post-secondary. Several states, Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee, were really poised to have pretty big education years, particularly for post-secondary, and all of that is obviously halted, if not negatively impacted. We've also seen several states make adjustments to the final months of their fiscal year 2020 budget that impact post-secondary. One major example is that New Jersey froze $920 million in the state's spending for the remainder of their budget, which ends up being a $122 million cut for public colleges and universities. How those cuts are allocated is still to be determined. We're advocating that they be allocated in a way that considers equity and access, particularly for students of color and low-income students. And then the third way that we kind of connect with state policymakers is really to share and disseminate and collaborate on potential responses and solutions to the impacts of COVID-19, again, on post-secondary access and equity. This does include the role that states can play in the CARES Act resources, both those that are directed to the institutions that Megan referenced, as well as that smaller pot of money, the GEAR dollars, that are discretionary dollars for governors to allocate and address K-12 and post-secondary needs. Just some highlights in terms of, particularly on that. I'm happy to also weigh in as we get into discussion some of the overall responses that states have taken to address kind of initial impact of post-secondary of COVID-19. But as it relates specifically to the CARES Act, as Megan stated, the majority of the dollars goes directly to institutions. So the role of states or systems is pretty limited. However, we have had conversations with states about the need to help institutions navigate some of those challenges that Megan referenced, the kind of inconsistent guidance from the federal government, as well as just the capacity and whatever reporting requirements there might be. In New Jersey, they're talking about kind of stressing and working with institutions to provide balancing efficiency with equity, getting the dollars out the door, but making sure that you are being as targeted as you can to students that do have an expense, but as best as you can, matching that with need. Certainly kind of, working with institutions to create a funding formula. We also have states that are trying to connect institutions with data that can really help understand the most vulnerable students, and again, help to document. There's certainly a need component of that, but the expense component of that. So making sure that we aren't losing track. staying within the guidance offered by the federal government, but not losing track of the real need of students, and particularly those students that we've prioritized. Washington has kind of encouraged financial aid administrators to use compassionate professional judgment over a compliance approach, and community colleges are developing a handbook with guidance. So there's a whole host of ways that states are trying to help institutions build their capacity and their ability to respond to this. Then there is a smaller $3 billion set aside for the governor's emergency education relief. And this remains, I think, an undecided or a developing conversation with states. Many states are still trying to sort through, again, what the parameters are. It can be used for both K-12 and post-secondary, but states have not really decided, or governors have not really decided how best to use that. We do see several states like Louisiana and Oregon trying to create partnerships between K-12 and post-secondary and address needs that implicate both of those, particularly access to technology, supplying laptops, those types of things. So I'm going to wrap up, but as I close, and I think we'll get into this, I do think one of the discussions that's important to have for those that may reread the Inside Higher Ed piece, the distribution formula of the CARES Act is somewhat inequitable in our view. The way that the funds were distributed really prioritized institutions that are serving full-time students, and therefore did a disservice to those schools that are serving high proportions of underrepresented students, and something that we are working to fix in whatever might come next. And certainly that relates to states and the need for states to prioritize and be strategic in how they're making cuts or adjustments to their post-secondary budget to really prioritize those institutions that are serving low-income students and high populations of students of color. So I will close there, and again, happy to answer any questions as we get into discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you, Martha. I was struck by a few thoughts as you were speaking, namely that I think there's a couple of roles for philanthropy to play in this moment as budget revenues are being adjusted and resource allocation decisions are being made. And there's a role for those philanthropic institutions that have relationships with specific higher ed institutions to really play both an advocacy role, just as you're saying, and sort of making sure that cuts don't harm the most vulnerable, and that we preserve equity and access, and potentially in supporting institutions with capacity or expertise in how to make strategic resource allocation decisions to I guess, blunt the severity of those cuts. So let's turn now to our last panelist, Michelle Siqueiros of the Campaign for College Opportunity, who's really going to provide a local perspective after we've gotten both a federal and a national perspective. And Michelle, I think your contribution here is very timely given some of the dramatic announcements that are coming out of California's higher education institutions recently. So hoping you can just give us a quick overview of the campaign itself and how the state of California and its public institutions are adjusting to this moment.
Thank you, Alex, and it's great to follow Megan and Martha's timely remarks. The Campaign for College Opportunity, I think many of you are already familiar with our work, but for those who may not be, I thought it would be important to kind of kick off with that. We are a statewide nonprofit advocacy organization. Our mission and focus is to ensure that more Californians can be prepared for college, can attend college, and that once they get there, they're actually served so that they can complete college. And so a lot of our work over the past 16 years has focused on advocacy, especially at the state level, certainly at the federal level when it comes to Pell dollars and aid for our neediest students in our state, but primarily at the state level, both advocating for additional, sufficient, adequate funding for higher education, in particular our community colleges, our Cal States, our UCs, which are the biggest systems in the world in terms of the number of students they serve, and also, advocating for the kinds of reforms that we think really support student success. So many of you have become familiar with our work because we've championed improving the transfer pathway from community college to the four-year institutions. A few years ago, we were instrumental in ensuring a new funding formula for the community colleges that funded our students and our campuses more than just based on the enrollment number that they represented, but also based on need in terms of low income status, as well as based on an incentive. 10% of the funding formula now is based on student success outcomes and measures that we have pushed very hard for. Those are just two examples. A big example that I think is really one of the biggest civil rights issues facing higher education is remedial education and placement practices that are very inequitable in terms of the impact that they have, especially on low income and students of color. So we have championed eliminating the use of placement exams in the community college system, pushing for the kind of professional development supportive faculty to establish the kind of courses that we know students are able to succeed in. So we're in the midst of a lot of these incredible reforms that we have fought long and hard for. And pre-COVID-19, we're entering 2020 at a place where we felt the big issue for higher education this year would be strengthening our financial aid system to address some of the inequities, especially low-income community college students face in our state in terms of access. We have a very generous access to aid program called the Cal Grant, yet we spend a lot of our financial aid dollars on students that attend our four-year universities and attend full-time. While we have fee waivers, we don't have enough support for low-income students to cover the full cost of college, not just tuition and fees, as many of you know is insufficient for any college student trying to get through. So those were what we thought would be some of the main issues. We have a governor that has been a big champion for higher education in our state. We were sitting on $17 billion surplus. And as Martha shared earlier, the breaking news last week is that we expect a $54 billion deficit. So certainly federal funding to states to help support our ability and our state's ability to really fund education is going to be critical. Not surprising, higher education in California is one of the three areas that are really the flexible areas of the budget. So when cuts come in any recession, higher education takes the biggest hit. At the same time, we know that as folks are losing jobs, community colleges become a huge area of demand. So in our state, we've certainly seen a rapid pivot, like everywhere else, to distance education. And we have chosen to focus our priority on what I would say are two constituencies. The first and immediate one was future college students. So really pushing colleges and universities to be flexible around deposits, pushing them to extend their statement of intent to register deadline from May 1st to June 1st. We were thankful to see that a lot of universities did that, but the UC did not, and most of the CSU campuses did not. And so that's really problematic in an environment where the class of 2020 right now is stuck at home and doesn't have access to counseling and advising, financial aid information that would help determine their decision making, right? So that's one constituency. We were certainly grateful that the University of California early came out and said that SAT, ACT would no longer be a requirement for admission, so giving a relief to current juniors who now are scrambling in terms of whether or not they can even take the test. And we've also seen a lot of flexibility in other ways for those students. We remain incredibly concerned about the getting real-time data on drop rates, and certainly getting that information by race and ethnicity in an environment where we know, to Martha's earlier point, a lot of low-income students are really struggling with Wi-Fi access, the right technology on their laptops, if they're lucky to have one, in order to access distance education, and even just the basics that many of us take for granted. I get to sit in a room that's very quiet in my house. That's not the case for a lot of low-income families that are crowded in a space that may not provide adequacy for them to study and certainly for them to learn. And maybe they've now taken on additional responsibilities of taking care of children and others in their environment. So there's a ton of issues, obviously, that we are challenged with. And this pandemic has definitely shined a bright light on inequality in our country, especially for low-income students. And we know disproportionately those are students of color. And so we will continue to kind of focus our advocacy and work championing follow-up to the CARES Act that does provide flexibility, that does provide additional aid. Certainly, this week's breaking news that Alex, alluded to came from every one of the higher ed segments. Chancellor Eloy Oakley and the Attorney General of California have sued the Department of Ed for excluding students from CARES Act, including documented, undocumented, veteran students, and others that are not able to access those dollars. The Cal State University system announced yesterday that all of its campuses would start online in the fall. And the University of California president announced yesterday that it would recommend to the UC Board of Regents to drop the use of the SAT, ACT in admissions and develop a new test within 5 years or drop it altogether. So lots of new
really dramatic actions that have been taken in California. I think the picture that comes across for me from all three panelists is a moment where the needs perhaps have never been greater and state revenues are plummeting. And yet we have this one-time infusion of federal funds coming in. And so I'd like to move us into some conversation now between all three panelists. And just to get us started, I'm wondering if any of you can share one or two very concrete examples of actions that you think an institution or a system of higher education could do right now using funds from the CARES Act to really help support the basic needs of students and shore up some of the access and attainment concerns that we've all shared.
I can go ahead and start if that's all right, Martha and Michelle.
Please.
As I mentioned before, if we're looking specifically at the student portion of the CARES Act, there are those kind of rather strict requirements that you have to be able to document that a student does have an expense related to the campus disruption. But there's a secondary piece to that, and this was actually in the ed guidance encouraged by the Secretary of Education to really encourage institutions to, after they have identified an expense or a certain group of students with an expense, then focus on giving money to the students with the highest needs. So we've had, for example, institutions who have identified expenses related to, let's just say, additional childcare or transportation or technology, but then decided that of that pool of students, they were going to focus on their Pell population. So I think that's one way that you are, still being in compliance, but then taking that and making sure that your neediest students are getting the funds.
That's great. Thanks, Megan. Martha or Michelle, any other thoughts?
No, I mean, I would echo that. I think certainly, trying to, as best as you can, prioritize those, based on need. The other thing that relates to this is certainly those students whose family financial situation may have changed as a result of COVID-19, who were not identified as, receiving Pell or Title IV eligible prior to this, not counting the much broader issue of the undocumented students, but working with those students to get their need documented and be determined in some way as Title IV eligible. That's another way to try and that I think institutions and states can play a role in helping students.
I would just end by saying that I think we can all agree now that having Wi-Fi and a functioning laptop with adequate software is more important today than pen and paper is, and that every K-12 student and every higher ed student deserves to have that.
Well said, Michelle. So given those actions and given the sort of both the opportunities and the limitations of CARES Act funds, I mean, what are some specific thoughts you have for where foundations and philanthropy might step in? I mean, are there ways in which we can be targeting philanthropic funds as part of the solution or to complement some of the CARES Act responses that you're seeing?
Well, I can kick this one off by pointing out that, the ECMC Foundation and College Futures Foundation and several others jumped in California to establish an emergency aid grant system that rolled out incredibly quickly, and within 24 hours had already distributed thousands of, more than $2.5 million, Angela can correct me, to thousands of students, and is sitting on a list of 65,000 additional students that met the requirements and the need for aid. So I think a rapid response like that is really important because it also signals to our state leaders how they have to be strategic in thinking about financial aid, knowing that philanthropy can't ever fill the full gap of need that exists out there, right? But how can it inform the real systemic change that can happen at a state or federal level?
Yes, Michelle is correct. We contributed to the Mission Asset Fund alongside College Futures Foundation and other both local and national funders. And the total amount that was contributed at that time earlier last month was about $2.25 million. The goal to raise $5 million. And within about 36 hours of opening that portal, all funds were spoken for. So 60,000 students currently remain on that wait list. And there is definitely an overwhelming need that has been present, both in California, but I would say nationally as well.
Angela, I think that's a great example of where foundation's ability to move quickly matters greatly. We heard that a lot of the federal government guidance is still coming down, and that slows down the ability to draw federal funds towards some of this. And so foundations have a chance to move quickly, to set a tone, to exert some leadership right now, and to help bring others along. Megan and Martha, any other thoughts that you guys have for specific actions that philanthropy could take in this moment?
You know, one of the things that I think we're hearing a lot of is just helping states and institutions build their data capacity to really track and understand the impacts of this on students in a more holistic way, certainly in a disaggregated way, to the degree that that philanthropy can play any sort of role in helping to build that capacity. I think estimates of somewhere from 20 to 25%, depending on the institution, but in an aggregate of students are just not even accounted for. And again, building the capacity of institutions to personalize outreach and get in touch with those students in some way, I think is critical.
Yeah, I would echo both of those things. And then also just, many institutions already have, and some of them fairly robust emergency grant aid programs on their own. But I think a lot of them are still learning how to make those programs effective, make sure they're having the desired outcomes. And so to the extent the philanthropic world can help sort of build capacity there too, and sort of building out strong programs that are meaningful and have good outcomes. I think that's another space as well.
Yeah. Well, let's pick up that thread for a moment, if we could, because we've certainly talked quite a bit about emergency aid, but I'm also curious whether there are longer term improvements, whether they be structural or systemic, to higher education that CARES Act funds can really help to kind of mobilize and focus us right now. And I think, again, this is a situation where foundations have both influence and some limited dollars that we can put out quickly to really help encourage some longer term thinking that leads us to structural change. So questions or thoughts that you guys have about what we could be doing from the philanthropic sector to really push for some longer term changes?
I think one of the longer term changes, Alex, that really was seeded by philanthropy that is a good example, in my opinion, was the reforms around remedial education, right? There was a lot of investment in innovative faculty that were doing co-requisites. And I think that the big challenge is pretty clear that we're going to be in this modality of online instruction for a while. So where can philanthropy help bring to light best practices around that modality, innovation that could later then be scaled in a way that we have seen now some of those remedial ed reforms be scaled across our state in California and a lot of other places, because it is very clear that online learning happens very differently across socioeconomic status and across race and ethnicity. And that is what keeps me up at night is we are potentially sitting in a time and place where we could lose hundreds of thousands of potential college students that never enroll, and hundreds of thousands who drop out because of the quality of instruction that they are receiving. So how can we really mitigate that? I think philanthropy could play an important role in that.
Yeah. I was going to say something similar, but just building on that, I think certainly the instruction, there's also just right, how do you provide supports and services to students in a virtual environment? And again, the need for that to be of higher quality than what probably currently exists right now because of the light switch that was flipped pretty much overnight. So helping institutions build innovations around engaging students in a more support-oriented fashion. I also think, I do think states and particularly systems, particularly I would say community college systems, are going to leverage this opportunity to really identify what are those barriers that COVID-19 really shed a light on for students. And so giving those systems and those institutions the support to really drive those reforms more holistically and to sustain beyond COVID-19. I certainly think Michelle alluded to some of them, but there are certain things in terms of placement tests that you can no longer administer. Those should never come back. We should be sustaining those kind of forced reforms beyond this particular moment, however long it may last, and to the degree that philanthropy can play a role in advancing those reforms and the sustainability of those reforms, I think is critical.
Yes, I would agree with all of those things. And just to say that I think, the CARES funding was really kind of, if we think big picture about how this works, a relief bill. And then, we're hoping with the upcoming pieces of legislation, they will move toward, recovery and stabilization. And so I think, the biggest thing we want to ensure there is that we have an infrastructure of higher education, and it might look a little bit different, but also kind of protecting that. And that, of course, includes things like enrollment and re-enrollment. So to the extent that, philanthropy can support FAFSA completion and college access organizations. I mean, I think that not necessarily institutions, right, but organizations that support institutions, I think is a really important piece of it as well.
Sorry, Alex, if I can jump in with one more thing, just in terms of, when we're talking about at the state level and going back to the impacts of this on state budgets and, the reality is that there are going to be cuts in some way. Philanthropy can certainly play a role in advocating or telling the narrative of the role that post-secondary access and opportunity will play to state recovery. There is no path to state economic recovery that doesn't include post-secondary in some capacity. And then also the need for any cuts or finance decisions to be weighed in terms that value equity and access for the most impacted populations, of which are particularly low-income students, student of color, displaced workers. So the degree that you can connect states and policymakers in a way that builds that framework, I think is a role for philanthropy to play.
Perfect. So let me just underscore a few of the things that I heard. I heard a very clear sort of bully pulpit communications opportunity to remind folks that post-secondary attainment is an economic recovery strategy. I heard the importance of really supporting the transition of high school seniors into post-secondary right now through things like FAFSA completion, advising, making sure there's a warm handoff, knowing that for many of these seniors, it'll have been 4, 5, 6 months that they've been disconnected from a learning institution. I heard the importance of remedial education and rethinking those structures is perhaps more important than ever, given some of the learning gaps that we can expect to see students coming in with. And I heard the importance of instruction and making sure that there's capacity and expertise to help higher ed faculty transition their instruction to be sufficiently dynamic in an online medium, as well as sort of the opportunity to rethink some of the barriers that we put in place, such as placement tests, that really get in the way of student success sometimes. So let me pose one more quick question. Megan, I think this is probably directly for you, and then we're going to turn to some of the questions that the audience has raised. So curious what you're hearing in terms of what higher education is asking for, and what do you anticipate Congress will do next? You alluded to sort of a next phase of recovery and stabilization, and would you mind just sort of sharing a few thoughts on what that could look like?
Yes, so we know that Congress is actively working on a fourth COVID response bill, and actually just yesterday the House released their draft version of that bill. It was a very big bill, about $3 trillion, and very much focused on stabilization and recovery, so moving kind of away from the immediate relief to some of the longer term things. A lot of money in there for states' big picture, and there was also an additional $37 billion in there for higher education, $27 billion of which would be funneled through the states. So it looks like that might be, as some have said, a pretty uphill climb for the Senate to take that bill. But I think big picture, what the community is interested in is more money for higher education. So first things first, more money, and also more flexibility. So if there is new money, can we make it less restrictive than what was in the CARES funds in terms of it needing to be tied to an expense or needing to be tied to a change in delivery of instruction? Can we make it more tailored toward need? There's also a big push by the community, and I was pleasantly surprised to see this in the House bill to put in a provision that would restrict the Department of Education from making requirements on student eligibility, and that would be retroactive in nature for the CARES Act. So basically what that would say is this whole piece about students having to be Title IV eligible would basically be retroactively fixed. So institutions could give to all students, and institutions who maybe before they knew this and gave it to some students who weren't would be protected under a safe harbor. So those are kind of some of the big picture things. I think one thing that it will be interesting to see is, this House bill really funnels a lot of the money for the public institutions through the states, which is very different than what the CARES Act did. So I think that's kind of a big question as to whether the Senate will take that approach or want to sort of stick with what we have now already with this higher education emergency relief fund.
Wonderful. Thanks, Megan. So let's move to audience questions right now. And let's see how many we can get through in the next 10 minutes or so. So maybe I'll pose a question. We'll just have one answer and then we'll just keep going. So first question, how will doubling the federal Pell Grant help students of color and low-income students specifically?
I guess I'll tackle that in terms of, just in theory, right, that high proportions of students of color and student are Pell eligible, and they have needs well beyond that is typically covered by Pell grants. So doubling it would allow those students to use it for things well beyond just tuition and fees, some of those other costs of attendance that are oftentimes left out of consideration or calculations, which can include living expenses, transportation, books, etc. Well, in this case, computers, perhaps. So that's, kind of one indirect way. I think doubling it would certainly help all Pell eligible students, but particularly, some of those disparate impacts of access and costs on students of color.
Great. Thanks, Martha. Next question. Yesterday, the Federal Department of Education launched a $127 million grant program for short-term programs. I think this is alluding to the workforce development efforts. So the question is, do you have a sense of potential impact? Do you think money will go to institutions of higher education or private training programs?
I am not entirely sure what how that will be used. There's not a lot of information out yet. It seems like it'll be a competitive grant, a potential opportunity to push for some innovation. But whether or not that'll go to institutions, particularly probably community colleges or technical schools or private training, I am not entirely sure what the parameters of that will be.
Yeah, and if I remember, potential is really only for 8 to 10 grants under that program, so it's fairly modest pot of funds. Next question. If a foundation decides to provide students with scholarships to register for online summer classes, will this aid displace fall and spring semester financial aid in the upcoming academic year and beyond? College partners are unclear if providing the support will affect their overall aid allocated from FAFSA.
So one of the answers we give all the time in financial aid is it depends. So what I can tell you is that this money would count as estimated financial assistance. So it potentially could, but it depends on whether the school has summer as a header or a trailer. So what I'm going to do is make the offer for whoever asked the question. If they want to reach out to me separately to give me some of the more details, I'd be happy to talk with you about how that would impact.
Yes.
Great.
And
Thank you,
we can
Megan.
also-
And I suspect there are a number. Please go ahead, Angela.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just want to ask the panel real quickly. Is everyone here comfortable sharing their information with our attendees following this session today? I see nodding heads. Okay, great. Thank you.
Alex, just really quick on that. I think certainly, the federal impacts is definitely, it depends. There certainly could also be a conversation to have with states that have their own financial aid programs. I know Washington has already taken steps to make sure that the supplemental funds from the CARES Act and any other supports are not calculated against their state grant program. So those are also conversations Central Role for Philanthropy is working with states to make sure that these additional funds don't get counted towards overall aid packages at the state level.
That's great. Thanks to you both. And I think the context here is there are a number of participants on the line whose foundations offer direct scholarship to students, and they want to make sure that those resources are maximized and don't supplant from elsewhere. Angela, maybe I could turn to you and you can tee up a few additional questions that you've been seeing coming in.
Sure. Been trying to grab as many as I'm seeing as quickly as possible. So thank you for everyone on the line who has been jumping into the chat or into the Q&A box. Actually, on a related note, so one of the questions that came in is, will recent guidance for e-grants and the CARES Act aid change how, in the long term, how we think about the real and true full cost of attendance, and will it open up new ways to fund non-educational expenses, or as we often say, basic needs for our students?
I think it opens the door for those conversations. It's always sort of tough when we get into issues of taxability, and historically there hasn't been a whole lot of wiggle room there in working with the IRS on that. But I do think it forces people, I think, to look at this a little bit more and see what the impacts are. So I think yes, it does open the door.
Yeah, I think like so many other things, those conversations were starting to bubble up pre-COVID. COVID put a much more amplified spotlight on the realities that there's much broader cost of attendance and student needs beyond just what might be kind of your assumed impact. So it certainly amplified that and provides opportunity to lever or bring up the conversation to another level. Whether or not it'll change actual award scenarios, I think is a different conversation.
Michelle, I got one that I think would you'd probably be quite an interesting voice on this, given all the campaigns work, especially around community college related efforts and ADT. But the question is, what can philanthropy do to ensure that students who have been bound for four-year institutions don't push out other students at community colleges? In other words, understanding that obviously many students have shifted their plans, maybe choosing more local options than previously thought. How do we know that there's not going to be a sudden surge now at the CC level?
I think we know there is going to be a sudden surge at the community college level. And so I think philanthropy elevating the important role that community colleges play. Obviously, this can't be solved by community colleges. We need to make sure that state funding is increased at a time when we're going to see decreased budgets potentially, right? So I think we all have to make the case for funding and investing in capacity, because the push out can't happen if we have enough capacity. So that's one piece that is really related to money and to highlighting the value of community colleges in our states. The second, I would say, is ensuring that all of the reforms we've been championing are accelerated during this time. Pathways in and through become so much more important, because that's a way to solve capacity without additional money. Which is, how do we make sure that students can transfer in and out of these institutions much more seamlessly. And that's going to be absolutely critical. And I share that as the mom of a class of 2020 senior who made that exact decision a few weeks ago, decided not to commit to the 4 years she had intended to, and will be enrolling at a community college. And so I think it is going to be incumbent upon all of us to make sure that, again, the online instruction that is received by students doesn't push them out. As well. So I think there's a lot of important ways that philanthropy can be really supportive at elevating the important role community colleges play.
Thank you. I have a question that I think would be great for I have two, I think, final questions that'll be great for the full panel. One, let's start here. How do you think the landscape of higher education will change as a result of the crisis? Obviously, we're seeing a lot of sudden shifts right now, but maybe I think what we're getting to here is what changes may be permanent or at least more long-term. And on top of that, is there a role for philanthropy to assist institutions to do some financial scenario modeling?
Yeah, so I'll start, and I think just overall, some of the things that we talked about, ideally, some of these reforms or these kind of immediate responses that got put into place are longer lasting and provides an opportunity to change the landscape. I'm so glad that Michelle brought up transfer as a key aspect of all of this, building policies and transfer pathways within the system of higher education. In terms of impacts on kind of specific, colleges and their ability to survive and the kind of impacts of this financially on them. I certainly think there are a set of institutions that were on the margins to begin with. And particularly, absolutely a lot of the news is around on those institutions is around the small private liberal arts colleges, but there are a set of public institutions that had significant financial capacity issues and being able to support them in some sort of modeling absolutely, I think would be something that philanthropy could play a role in, and particularly in a way that helps them understand, and if it can be done in a way, again, that kind of maps back to access, supports, and success for priority populations that have been identified, low-income students, students of color, any of that financial modeling scenarios, as well as, the reforms that are necessary and what that looks like in terms of an ROI perspective. I think are all, again, a role that philanthropy could play.
Yeah, I don't know that I have anything to add to that. That was a great, great answer.
Any thoughts on corporate partners specifically during this time, or what level of support that they could offer? That came in from one of our listeners. Okay, I'll leave it there then.
Well,
go ahead,
Angela. I think I don't know that I see a huge difference, but I also think that, corporate philanthropy can be really instrumental, again, at elevating the critical role that community colleges play and providing that kind of leadership and support in this time, especially. So I think to the extent that it can elevate those conversations, to the extent they're interested in supporting professional development for community college faculty in particular, and some of those innovative practices, especially corporate philanthropy that is, high-tech philanthropy, right? That can really speak to the distance learning piece that I think is so intimately an important response in this current situation.
thank you. We have just about a couple minutes left here, and I see that we did get we have a couple of very fast last minute questions that are coming in right now. I want to see if we can answer them within a couple minutes. All right, if anyone is able to respond once, then I'll leave that to that individual to take the question. One is, have the resources in the CARES Act for higher ed already hit the street, or are those funds being held up by efforts to understand administration of funds?
I can take this one and say that some are already in student hands and others are not, and it just depends on the institution. The first set of guidance came out along with the certification agreement for the students to sign and send into the department to get their funds back on April 9th. So institutions that did that right away would already have their funds, but then we did receive subsequent guidance on April 21st that changed things in terms of eligibility, and we're expecting some again this week. So I think schools have been making the decisions of basically risk assessments, right? Of do I get this money out now? Do I wait and see what comes out from Ed? So some have made the move and some have not.
Great, thank you. I do want to make sure that we end on the hour. So for for all of our panelists, I just want to say thank you very much for making time out of your busy schedules today to share with our GFE community at large, and especially with our post-secondary access and attainment group. For anyone else on this line who is interested in connecting with the PSA2, I'm going to actually just quickly drop my information into the chat box. You are welcome to email me directly, as well as if you have any interest in either sharing this recording or also reviewing it yourself, you will receive a copy of this particular webinar session, as well as any resources that were mentioned during this webinar or that our panelists may have to share in follow-up. If you would like to connect with panelists individually, we will also make their contact information available as well. For the last minute, I do want to make sure that we acknowledge Celine Coggins, who is our president at Grantmakers for Education. Thank you for joining. If there are any last minute remarks or questions or comments that you would like to have everyone listening be aware of, I turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you all so much, and especially thank you to Angela and Alex. This has been great. And I just want to let people know we have another webinar tomorrow with the Riggs Foundation and some other partners on supporting students who are homeless through the COVID crisis.
Thank you all very much. We will leave you to the rest of your afternoons, and may you continue to have an increasingly more stable week ahead.